a reminder about these rules, my laws of honest inquiry, and always concentrating on the last one. I could be wrong about anything. This is something that I've noticed some people have a great deal of difficulty with. They can't believe that they could be wrong. And so it's good to know that the absolute truth is absolutely revealed to a few people who are capable of somehow absolutely knowing it, or at least that's what they think. Not persuaded by that argument, because all reality is a combination of the construct of your nervous system, of the information you receive, and a social construct in which we live. So I could be wrong about anything. This is what we're going to talk about today, in part because, so here's sort of the historical stuff. 333 BC is, I think is that the date of the death of Alexander the Great? So this is the late 4th century. The Greek Empire has spread, and it spread in particular Greek culture. Part of the thing that Alexander the Great was doing was not just conquering an empire, but disseminating a cultural idea. And technically, Alexander wasn't Greek, he was Macedonian, but Greek culture became a driving force. Now, there were things about Greek culture that were weird to people in the Middle East. For example, you all know the word gymnasium. Do you know what the word gymnasium means? Yeah, Phil, share that with them.
School!
No.
No?
No, it means building where you're naked.
Hey, then not school. See, as I work it out, I like yours better. I don't think so.
The reason for this was that the Greek attitude towards body was diametrically opposed to, say, the attitude of the Israelites towards body. So if you remember the very opening story in the second story in the Bible, the one that is the Garden of Eden story, at that point where Adam and Eve have eaten of the fruit of the knowledge of harmful and beneficial, it says, and they realized they were naked and they were ashamed. And then they have to go, like make clothes out of whatever's available. So in Jewish culture, modern Jewish culture, nudity is a thing that's largely avoided. When you're preparing a dead body, for example, you have to do it in such a way that at no time is the body actually naked. Yeah. And so you can understand the culture shock when suddenly the Greeks show up and they're like, gymnasium. And they're building gymnasiums and they're building Greek cities in the midst of these non-Greek cultures. This is happening at the end of the 4th century, the beginning of the 3rd century BCE. And it's not that much longer when there's a huge civil war in Judea, in Palestine, between two groups of people who are Israelites. But one group says, we want to be Greek, do it the Greek way. And the other group is like, no, we must be traditional. And there's a civil war about this called the Maccabean War. And you can read all about it in what's called the Apocrypha, which is a set of books between what we call Old Testament and New Testament that is found in the Bibles in the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox churches. When that occurs, 4th century, we do start to see the beginning. The Greeks had a different view of sexuality as well. They had this idea that women were icky and that the only reason to really have sexual relations with women was because you wanted to have children, which was important, but women were sort of an inferior, incomplete. The assumption was sort of like they didn't properly finish baking or whatever, I mean, that's kind of the idea they had, that male was the correct way to be and female was incomplete, but that was required because you'd have to have children. So, but other than that, the Greeks were like, you'd much rather be with a dude. And so for them, what we think of as homosexuality was just sexuality. It was just ordinary. They had this very different idea, and they're running into these other cultures that don't necessarily share that point of view. So when the Hebrew cultures in the 3rd century BC start to run into this Greek influence, they're shocked by it. It surprises them. They're not ready for it, and they have to kind of go looking for some place to say what it is, you know, because this is what we do. We go to the Bible to reassure us that we're right and to give us a place to kind of explain or hang our hat, you know, like, okay, that makes sense. And they ended up dropping in on the story of Sodom. And they were like, see, that explains it. This is what makes us so upset. This is why this bothers us. See, because it's judged by God. Ugh. And so the story of Sodom ends up being interpreted as actually about how the Greeks were. It's not just, it's literally becomes interpreted in terms of Greek sexuality and Greek practice. And this leads to this idea that sodomy, I mean, even the word sodomy, derives from this way of interpreting the story. Now, nowadays, biblical scholars look at that story, and to be honest, no decent biblical theologian will go, oh yeah, that's what that story's about. Not one. And so to me, this one, of the things we'll be talking about, we're only on the second week, right? This one is the red herring I have to get out of the way before we can talk about the ones that will really be more of a struggle and more like it'll hurt your brain. So there's a scholarly, when we talk about the scholarly analysis of scriptures, it's known as biblical criticism. The word criticism means analysis. For some reason, scholars don't like to use words the way you and I use words. So instead of saying biblical analysis, they say biblical criticism. And biblical criticism comes in a variety of forms. There's source criticism, redaction criticism, literary criticism, form criticism, a few others. The one that I'm interested in today is called form criticism. This is the idea that if you analyze, first it's the analysis of various literary forms in the Bible. So all these different styles of things. There are parables, there are sayings, there are poems, there's even a play. I don't know if you know this, but I think I use the word dialogue, but I mean it like a Socratic dialogue. If you've ever read Plato, you see these plays, which are dialogues, people talking to each other. Well, there's one of those in the Bible. It's called the Book of Job. And the play consists of 4 people, and they're having a conversation about God and the nature of suffering, and that's what it is. It's a really interesting dialogue. So you have all of these various forms, and the thing is that where that's great for working on a PhD by itself, but it's actually useful once you understand the fundamental concept, because you can use biblical stories of similar form to clarify the meanings of other stories with similar forms. In other words, by comparing stories that are basically similar stories and seeing how the forms lay out the same, they can help you understand each other. So I just want to let you think for a minute about a movie. Think about an action movie. And all action movies follow the same basic plot, right? They describe it in acts, you know, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, and they have a plot. If you get introduced to the main character, some flaw in the main character is introduced, some dynamic that's going to be a thing that our hero has to overcome. The villain gets introduced. We get to see how great a villain the villain is. At some point, there's a conflict. The first conflict between hero and villain, the villain wins. And then there's somewhere down, then there's the training sequence, you know, and then there's the second encounter between the hero and the villain, and there's usually a point that in my family we refer to as the "you kicked my dog." There's this look, you know, the hero's been knocked down, but then the villain does something so egregious. We call it, in my house, we call it "you kicked my dog," and you get the look on the hero's face, and then they win. Okay, so they just have this pattern, and these tropes are expected. So that's what we can do. We can look at that in the Bible too. So if you look at parables, narrative parables will tend to follow a certain kind of plot line that you can track out and you can look at, and you can see how that will give you information about how to understand, say, a parable. There are 2 stories that are form critically the same. One is the story in Genesis that we think of as the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, most people, if I say the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, they go, oh, Genesis 19, but it actually begins in Genesis 18. And there's another story in the book of Judges, Judges 19. These stories will track episode for episode next to each other. There's other things going on. I do need to say that. Just like no two action movies, even though they follow the same plot lines, they have all kinds of other details that are different. So the story in Genesis has a lot of other really intriguing stuff that gets thrown in, and a lot of which I have to leave out in today's discussion. I just need you to see how these two line up, because this helps us understand what the stories are about. So this first passage, so in black, that will be the Genesis story of Sodom and Gomorrah, and in blue, which the next screen will be, that's going to be the story from Judges. So the Lord appeared to Abraham, who, looking up, saw 3 men standing near him. Now, we come later to understand that the 3 men are God, the Lord himself, and 2, what we would refer to as angels. Looking up, Abraham saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree, and let me bring a little bread, that you might refresh yourselves. And after that you may keep going on your journeys, since you have come to your servant." And they said, "Do as you have said." Here's the one in Judges. The concubine of a certain Levite became angry with him, and she went away to her father's house at Bethlehem. Then the Levite set out after her to speak tenderly to her and bring her back. When he reached her father's house, the girl's father saw him and came with joy to meet him, and the girl's father made him stay, so that he remained with him 3 days. So they ate and drank, and he stayed there. Back to Genesis. Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it, and make cakes." And Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant, who hastened to prepare it. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree while they ate. I'm going to stop and make a cultural observation here. Different cultures have different rules about hospitality. The one that Abraham's in, the host stands by while the guests eat. I was the guest of honor at an Omani meal once, and my hosts left. And I was like, "What? They're leaving. Aren't they going to eat with us?" Because I'm from, we all sit around on the table. Oh no, that's how we do it here. So that the guests are not disturbed, the hosts leave and come back. So every culture has its own rules about this, and so they're very unique. So this story is Abraham, figure 18th century BC. The other story, the one in Judges, that story is probably maybe 11th century BC, considerably later, in other words. On the 4th day, so they've been there 3 days, on the 4th day they got up early in the morning, and the man prepared to go, but the girl's father said, "Fortify yourself with a bit of food, and then after that you may go." So the 2 men sat, ate, and drank together, and the girl's father said to the man, "Why not spend the night and enjoy yourself?" On the 5th day he got up early in the morning to leave, and the girl's father said, "Fortify yourself." So they lingered until the afternoon, and the 2 of them ate and drank. And when the man with his concubine and his servant got up to leave, the girl's father said to him, "Well, spend the night. See, the day is already drawn to a close. Spend the night here and enjoy yourself. Tomorrow you can get up early in the morning and go on your journey." But the man would not spend the night. He got up and departed. Okay. Do you see I'm from Minnesota. If you go to visit somebody, you announce, "We got to go," but you do that a good half hour to an hour before you actually leave. And there's a whole long process involving leftovers and Tupperwares that you promise to return. And then there's a whole thing about sitting. You're in your car with the window rolled down. This is we call it the long Minnesota goodbye. So this is the long 11th century Judean goodbye right here. Back to Genesis. Now the 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening. Lot was sitting in the gateway of Sodom, and when Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. He said, "Please, my lords, turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you can rise early and go on your way." They said, "No, we'll spend the night here in the square." But Lot urged them strongly. So they turned aside to him and entered his house, and he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. So urge them strongly, right? "Oh, before you go, you should let me get some leftovers made up for you." To which the correct answer is, "Oh, it was delicious, but that's okay. I'm full. Oh, no, I insist. Oh, well, I would love a little bit of the hot dish. Let me get that hook." Okay? That's what you're seeing here, is that exact kind of dynamic. I don't know if the same rules apply in Wisconsin or if they're similar, but now back to Judges. So the man, his concubine, and his servant went in to spend the night in the city of Gibeah. He went in and he sat down in the open square, but no one took them in to spend the night. So you can see right there's an expectation that something's supposed to happen, and it hasn't happened. Then at evening there was an old man coming from his work in the field. Now this man was from the hill country of Ephraim, but he was residing in Gibeah. Remember, this is actually in the text. I had to cut it out, but this is the second time the text makes this point. The people of Gibeah were Benjamites. So they're from a different tribe. When the old man looked up and saw the wayfarer in the open square of the city, he said, "Peace be to you. I will care for all your wants, only do not spend the night in the square." So he brought him into his house and fed the donkeys, and they washed their feet and ate and drank. Again, I've had to cut out a lot of stuff just to make it fit on the screen. There's a whole thing where this Levite is, when the old man asks him, "What are you doing here?" He says, "Well, nobody's offered us hospitality." So the story emphasizes that a bunch of times. Next. Before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all of the people, to the last man, surrounded the house. And they called out to Lot, "Where are those men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may get to know them." Judges. While they were enjoying themselves, the men of the city, a perverse lot, surrounded the house, started pounding on the door. They said to the old man, the master of the house, "Bring out that man who came into your house so we may get to know him." Lot went out of the door to the men, shut the door after him, and said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Look, I have 2 virgin daughters. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do with them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." And the old man went out to them and said, "No, my brothers, do not act so wickedly, since this man is my guest. Do not do this vile thing. Here are my virgin daughter and his concubine. Let me bring them out now. Ravish them and do whatever you want to them, but against this man do not do such a vile thing." Okay. Do you see how identical these two stories are? And the crowd said, "This fellow Lot is an outsider. He would judge us. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." And they pressed hard against Lot and came near the door to break it. But the men inside reached out their hands, brought Lot into the house with them, and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the door of the house. So because these are divine beings, this story takes a different twist right here than the other one. But the mob would not listen to him. So the man seized his concubine and put her out to them, and they wantonly raped her and abused her all through the night until the morning. And as the dawn began to break, they let her go. As morning appeared, the woman came and fell down dead at the door of the old man's house where her master was. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities and whatever grew upon the ground. So all the men of Israel gathered against the city of Gibeah, united as one, and put them to the sword. The city, the people, the animals, and all that remained, also the surrounding towns, they set on fire. So when we compare these, we see they have identical plot points. First, you have extravagant hospitality. Remember that Abraham says, oh, stop, have a little bread, little light refreshments. And then he goes running around the fatted calf, his wife is baking. I mean, how long did these guys have to sit here before there was food available? But he goes out of his way to do it right, and then follows and observes carefully the rules of hospitality. And then we have in the other story, the one in Judges, it starts out with 3 days, and then, no, stay another day, and no, he's trying to get them to stay longer and longer, fulfilling and extravagantly fulfilling the hospitality. The second one is in the town. So in Sodom, in the Genesis story, in Gibeah, in the Judges story, the only person to offer hospitality is the resident alien. Both stories make a point of this more than once. With the Lot story, it's in the dialogue. They're not even from here, and you're going to judge us? And in the Judges story, it's twice repeated that Gibeah is from Benjamin, and this guy is not. This old man is from Ephraim, so it's a completely different, a whole significantly different part of the land. The mob demands to get to know the strangers. Get to know is a difficult expression to translate, but if you go get to know, if you know what I mean, you get a better idea of what's being said there. And women and girls are offered to the crowd. And the male guests and the homeowner escape safely. And the city is judged and destroyed. Now there's a couple things that get emphasized. I want to point these out. Both stories emphasize prosper hospitality. And with that is this commitment to the protection of the male guests, that at the point of risking your own family. This is a very significant piece of that. It still exists in some parts of the world today. Once you've eaten with somebody, they'll risk everything to protect you, which is why we had such a hard time getting bin Laden, because he had eaten dinner with someone. And so then that tribe was obligated to protect him. If you want to see, actually, have you ever seen that movie, Soul Survivor? So what? Lone Survivor, yeah. You actually see an example of that. Yeah, in the Pashtun. So this is still today, this still happens. Both stories contrast the mob's violation of hospitality, and both stories, so with the proper hospitality, so this is the contrast in the stories, and both stories understand that the judgment comes because of the grave violation of the norms of hospitality. Okay, so that's really important, and any good biblical scholar will acknowledge that the stories are ultimately about the violation of hospitality. Now we can't help but look at stories from a modern point of view, so this is kind of our modern framework. These stories are about rape. The mob's apparent lack of concern about the gender of the victim comports with our modern understanding that sexual assault is about power and not sex. The women in the stories exist to protect and serve the men. And this is interesting. The assumption of the stories is that people are pansexual. So these stories are from, like 11th century BC and another story from 18th century BC. The idea is that they're not thinking of the way we think about sexual preference or something like that. They just assume that, that it doesn't really matter. Oh, you're asking for the guy? Well, how about we send out the virgin daughters? We don't, because it won't matter. So this idea of being pansexual, that anything will do, is a very different way of thinking, and it appears and disappears and appears and disappears in different cultures, in different places, in different times. It's a localized point of view, and it's contrasted with a very strongly dimorphic point of view, which is there's heterosexuality, male and female, and that's just how that is. In this story, there's an assumption of a kind of a pansexuality. So now, I would like you to find like 4 other people to sit and talk with for a minute, and here's the question that you're going to start discussing. Why would we want to take a story about violations of hospitality in the ancient world and make it about private sexual behavior between consenting adults? Go. In your group, what kind of answers did you maybe offer?
Why would you want to make it about private? I guess to
Good.
To take male guests, yeah, and throw your family out there.
That's pretty offensive. Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting that what the part we get hung up on in the story instead of focusing on. Maybe if I phrase it this way, why is it easier for us to talk about, to make this story or allow this story to be focused on private male sexual behavior instead of dealing with its actual context, which is hospitality?
Maybe because it's so egregious that you can't even really wrap your head around it.
It is that.
You wouldn't think of hospitality as ever going that far, but you can maybe equate something as a little more taboo to sexual behavior, something that could be also a little more taboo, such as violence.
So there is a kind of psychological ease to that, because we're so shocked by the hospitality dynamic that goes on there that we can't. It's much easier for us to just focus on the sexual behavior. Okay, here's your next question. Ready for it? Why would we want to take a story about rape and make it into a story about the problem of homosexuality rather than making it about the problem of rape? Remember, 25% of women, it's really hard to do the statistics on this because a lot of stuff goes unreported, but this is probably pretty decent numbers. 25% of women and 10% of men are either rape victims or victims of attempted rapes. While less than 10% of rapists are women, guess what that means? Over 90% of rapists are men. So why aren't we talking about that instead of this? Go. Just going to give you a couple minutes to talk about that. Oh, why not make the story about rape instead of making it about, like, yeah. I mean, we talk about the problem of homosexuality, but do we really have a problem with homosexuality? I think we have a problem with rape. I don't. So why aren't we talking about that? It's kind of the question.
I don't know that they looked at it that way if they were actually offering their daughters as an alternative without...
Well, back then they wouldn't have, but
Yeah, nowadays.
in context today.
Which raises all kinds of really interesting questions about, to use the technical term, male hegemony and stuff like that. The way in which women are second-class citizens. Still, women are second-class citizens. Yeah, every woman in the room knows what I'm talking about. The guys are like, what are you talking about? I treat women equally. So, no, I mean, you know, it's fascinating to see what happens the first time a church gets a female pastor. Now, very often, after about 2 or 3 weeks, they're like, our pastor's awesome. But that initial reaction says something about expectation, about culture, about all kinds of assumptions. And so, I mean, the point of the question is not really for you to find an answer. The point of the question is to point out that we have a tendency to love to make it about something that really isn't about us. Because see, if we talk about, especially if you go back 50 years, you almost never knew if someone was gay. It was really unusual to know that they were gay. And nowadays, you know if people are gay. So now you know gay people. Like, well, so my grandson's gay, or my brother's gay, or my whatever. But 50 years ago, that wasn't the case. But you knew someone who was a rape victim. You know? It's way closer to home. So it's a lot easier to talk about something else. By the way, that same psychology applies to infectious diseases. How many people die of the flu every year? What, 12,000 people a year die of the flu? And yet, when like 2 people got Ebola in this country, it was like freaking out, and they were like building like these isolation habitats in the middle of parking lots and stuff, because there's something about that rare exception that is more terrifying or troubling or compelling to us than the common reality of our lives.
The difference right there, the words rare versus common.
Yeah.
It's common, we just use it all the time, we don't think of
right. We get
wow factor of it.
we get inured to it. Yeah, we get inured to it, and so rape is incredibly common, and And yet we're not really spending a lot of time talking about it. It makes us uncomfortable because it's so close to home. And you understand that even the fact that I brought that up, there are people in this room for whom those statistics are true. Okay, how does the Bible... So now, those are intended to be provocative questions. Yeah, but I'm predominantly interested in the exegetics. So the question is, how does the Bible elsewhere understand the story of Sodom? So one of the ways in which the Bible uses the story of Sodom is it does show up. If you were to look up the word Sodom and just track out all of its appearances in the Bible, there's a whole bunch of them that are basically Sodom is simply means utter destruction, and it's in these sort of reflective ways, like if I had not rescued you from destruction, you would have been like Sodom. And the idea being that it just represented complete destruction. So here's one example. This is from 2 Peter. This top part we'll come back to later. For if God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of deepest darkness to be kept until the judgment. And if he did not spare the ancient world, even though he saved Noah, a herald of righteousness with 7 others, when he brought the flood on the world of the ungodly, and if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemned them to extinction and made them an example of what is coming to the ungodly. So the idea of Sodom is just kind of an example of this is the destruction that lays waste, or this is the example, the sort of byword for a fully destroyed place. Now that's a common use of Sodom, but what's really interesting is that we have in the prophet Ezekiel an actual description of, here's what Sodom's sin was. This is the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and the needy. And so here's your next question. How is this prophetic understanding of the sin of Sodom relevant to our culture? Go. I'm going to back it up so you can look at the text if you need to. You do understand that just in general, it's way easier to talk about Sodom and say, to identify a small portion of the population, what they estimate 10% of the population is gay. I don't know if that is an accurate number or not. But whatever that number is, it's a minority. So it's way easier to take a bunch of minority people and say, hey, that's about you guys, rather than to, I don't know about you, but I had plenty to eat today. And I can name more than one person who would assure you that I'm filled with pride. I'd be one of them, but there are a couple others. So Jesus also used the story of Sodom, and he brought it up. And so this is the story of Jesus sending out the 12 apostles. There's a similar parallel story where he sends out the 72. The 12 disciples Jesus sent out with the following instructions: go nowhere among the Gentiles, do not enter the towns of the Samaritans, but rather go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. As you go, proclaim the good news, the kingdom of heaven has come near. Cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons. Whatever town or village you enter, find out who in it is worthy and stay there until you leave. As you enter the house, greet it. If the house is worthy, let your peace come upon it, and if not, let your peace return to you. And if anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, shake off the dust of your feet as you leave that house or town. Truly, I tell you, it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah on that day of judgment than for that town. So I'm going to just bring up this one little section to repeat it for you. Whatever town or village you enter, find out who in it is worthy, stay there until you leave. Well, how do you don't just walk in the door and say, I'm staying at your house. Jesus would, every once in a while he did that, but that's not, they had to be invited, which in other words, accept the hospitality of someone respectful. He does say that, but he says stay there. He doesn't say, he says stay there until you leave, and the reason is that sometimes people would play the hospitality game. Like you come in and there's this poor guy who says, you can stay with me, and does the best they can, and then you start preaching and everyone's like, ooh, you come to be with my house. I live in the big house at the end of town, and then you're tempted, and Jesus is like, no. Whoever's the first one to offer you hospitality, that's the house you stay in, provided that they're a person deserving of the blessing. And if anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, welcome is about hospitality. Shake off the dust of your feet as you leave that house or that town. Truly, I tell you, it would be more tolerable. So can you see that Jesus is using the story of Sodom in its original context? That is, a story about hospitality. Jesus himself clearly understood that the story of Sodom was about the egregious violation of the rules of hospitality. And so he talks about hospitality and then uses Sodom as his example of what happens. Just like Sodom, in fact, it'll be worse if they don't welcome you and receive your words. So this becomes an interesting question if we start thinking in terms of hospitality and LGBTQ members of the community and stuff like that. The question, so this is your next discussion question, how might those issues of hospitality be relevant to our church with respect to the LGBTQ members of our community? Do you understand the question? Okay, talk about that for a little while. Good luck. Okay, I got to bring him back because I actually have some more really interesting stuff to throw your way. All right, so tell me. What were your thoughts? I overheard some interesting stuff. So what were your thoughts? Barb, do you want to go first? Because I just heard what you were saying. I thought it was really interesting.
I was just saying that sometimes we welcome people that are different, and we welcome them with open arms, but at the same time as we're welcoming, we're sort of have the mindset of saying, but, I'm going to help you change because your ways are wrong. So to me that is just as unhospitable as not welcoming someone.
Yeah. All right. Any other observations you want to make from the conversation you had? Any good gems you want to share?
Tell your story.
Ignoring them, not talking to them, not welcoming them, whoever they are, strangers. We have a tendency to only talk to the people we already know and want to know.
Yeah.
And if someone's sitting next to you and you've never seen them before, how many of us don't get up and go out that side of the aisle instead of going that way and having to bump into them?
Mm-hmm. So it's not even just about this. I mean, in its broad sense, it's about hospitality as a. I just didn't have time to split the question in two because I did have a question originally, just about hospitality in general and then specifically. So, other observations, Nikki? You look like you're ready.
I guess we were just talking about, that, at school now, because the kids in youth group and I have talked about this at school, it's very common to have LGBT couples at school, and I think Bill and I can share this viewpoint that at school, whether it's someone that has a different race or disability or religion or anything, I mean, as a teacher, you would never be allowed to, treat that person any differently. And if you did, they'd give you your box and say, see you later, you're done. And so I think it's really hard for our youth to go, okay, well, at school, we're very accepting, and at church now, oh, sorry, the place where you worship, sorry, nope. I think that's hard for kids to wrap their minds around.
Some adults too. I have had this experience where our discipline has gotten more restrictive over the years that I've been a pastor, to include in the last couple of disciplines rules that specifically prohibit pastors from performing like same-gender marriages or holding such ceremonies in the church. And I remember having a conversation with somebody where I was just mentioning that in passing, and the response was, "You mean my son can't get married in the church?" And that was like, think about that. That means my son can't get married in the church. And yet, this is supposed to be the place. Okay, so to end, I want to take you into some really So we're going into, just get ready for the deep dive. You won't have a chance to talk with each other about this, but I'm taking you into some just oddball, edgy kind of exegetics, which are kind of intriguing. Here's the first one. This is a story. This is from the book of Jude. Jude has something. There's some source relationship with 2 Peter because there's a lot of overlapping language. But in fact, this language up at the top was almost identical in the 2 Peter quote that was way, way earlier. But here it is in Jude. It's a little more explicit. Angels who did not keep their own domain but abandoned their proper abode, God has kept in eternal bonds under darkness for the judgment of the great day, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, since they, in the same way as these, okay, did not keep their proper abode, in the same way as these, indulged in gross immorality and went after alien flesh. They are exhibited as examples in undergoing the punishment of eternal fire. So what's happening here is that angels not keeping their proper abode is being compared with, in the same way, Sodom and Gomorrah. And then you have this very odd phrase, went after alien flesh. It's difficult, by the way, just to let you know, the Greek is difficult to translate here because we don't have quite the English words for it. The word here means another of a different sort. There are two words in Greek that roughly mean another, and one means another of a different sort, and the other means another of the same sort. And so I use the word alien to translate. It's super technical stuff, sorry. Now I'm going to read to you a story from Genesis 6. It came about when men began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God, so the Hebrew is B'nai Ha-Elohim, saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men of old, men of renown. Then the Lord saw the wickedness of man was great upon the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So I need for you to see the Genesis context here. So the mythic story of Genesis 6 describes heavenly beings, that is angels, leaving their proper abode. And now I use the word raping here, and the text says they took women. In the ancient world, there was no difference. Took them as wives, they raped them. The story in Genesis 19 describes human beings attempting to rape heavenly beings, because remember, those are angels in Sodom. The term for angel is Ben Ha-Elohim, or B'nai Ha-Elohim. So sons of the gods is the typical terminology for an angel. There's a different word, which is the literal word for angel, which is the word malach. In Hebrew, it just means messenger. The Greek word angel means messenger, but messenger understood, angel understood as heavenly being, is this word, is this B'nai word. So what you have is that in the story, each of these actions corrupts the divine order and results in judgment. So it's just an intriguing thing that within the book of Genesis, you have this Genesis 6 and Genesis 19 that are inverting each other, but both representing the same fundamental thing, a violation of a sort of separation of state that should be happening. And to me, that's just really esoteric and weird. So I had to share it with you. This next thing, when I read it, I was like, what? I know this text really well. I never noticed that before. And I realized a lot of times it was because of the way the English translated the underlying Greek and harmonized what Matthew has in Greek with what Luke has in Greek. So here it is, what Luke has. This is about this is sometimes referred to as the little apocalypse. So this is about the last days. As the lightning flashes and lights up the sky from one side to the other, so will the Son of Man be in his day. Just as it was in the days of Lot, again, there's Sodom. They were eating and drinking, buying and selling, planting and building. But on the day that Lot left Sodom, it rained fire and sulfur from heaven and destroyed all of them. So again, please notice that Jesus doesn't go where we typically go with that story. It will be like that on the day that the Son of Man is revealed. I tell you, that night there will be two men in one bed, one will be taken and the other left. There will be two women grinding together, and one will be taken and the other left. So The Matthew text of this says two women grinding meal. And it adds the Greek word moule, meal. That's not what the Luke text says. And it turns out that the word grind is used sometimes as a circumlocution, a polite way of, well, polite isn't actually the right word because the way the Hebrew writers were, they were very earthy, but it means having sex, or can mean having sex. It can mean grinding, but it can mean having sex. And there are like 4 different times in what we call Old Testament where the word is used that way. I'm only going to give you one of them because it's the most obvious. This is from the book of Job. Job is arguing why the punishment isn't, his friends are suggesting maybe he was cheating on his wife. He says, if my heart has been enticed by another woman, if I have lain in wait at my neighbor's door, then let my wife grind for another and let other men kneel over her, if you get what I mean, right? So Jesus seems to be suggesting here that, I mean, in the story of, this is the often taken for those who are in the evangelical world, this is considered the rapture. One is taken, one is left. And yet, it kind of looks like he's describing 2 male lovers and 2 female lovers at the moment that the day overtakes, and one is taken and one is left. I'm not sure which is better, to be taken or left. You really can't tell in the text, but in modern apocalyptic theology, it's better to be taken. So to me, that's just so esoteric and weird. Now, I had to put that out there just because I just thought, huh. And I'm not going to go that I 100% agree with that interpretation, but I am going to go, the exegetics is solid. So that it is a solid interpretation of the text based on the way in which the words are used. And knowing Matthew as I do, Matthew fixing language to make it less offensive, the idea of Matthew dropping in the word grinding wheat together, the implication that they're at the millstone, that's very Matthean. That sounds like how Matthew operates to me. So I can imagine this being the original text. Like I said, many English translations insert the word that is not there to harmonize what this is in Luke with what is in Matthew to make them identical. Yeah, Bill.
It doesn't seem to me like it would be logical to take the first sentence above 35 and say that that is about sex, and then to say in the next thing.
Right. So this one could go either way. This could be like 2 people just happen to be in the same bed.
Why don't they parallel each other?
But they could be paralleling each other.
Why don't use the exact same language, though? What purpose does it serve?
Typical Hebrew parallelism. Yeah, it's a thing in Hebrew parallelism where a lot of times you'll say a thing and then you say it again. So this actually becomes an issue when we get to some New Testament stuff. This is New Testament stuff, but when we get in particular in Romans, there's a piece in there, and if it's one kind of parallelism, it means one thing. If it's a different kind of parallelism, it means a different thing, and that becomes very complicated. So what I see here is that I could interpret this as, I could say, well, grinding, the assumption here is that they're just working together, and that for whatever reason there are these 2 men in the bed. At the same time, based on this actual use of the word in the Bible and the way it was understood, I can see the other one too. So I'm not trying to make it say that's what it's saying. I'm just saying, but I told you I was going to take that these 2 things where I was going to go here right at the end was just into some really odd esoteric kind of stuff. Now, if most people say Jesus never talks about the issue of homosexuality, but maybe he did. Notice how I put that. Maybe he did. I'm not putting my finger down there, but I am saying that exegetically it works, and in terms of how parallelism works in if you read poetry, Hebrew poetry is based on parallelism. It works there too, because very often, in fact, I was just doing this today. I was inserting the verb into the second line of the parallelism. Which is not necessary. So sometimes you include the verb only in one of the 2 parallel lines, or you use different verbs that which should be understood to mean the same thing. So to have men lying in bed together maybe should be understood as grinding together. It's how parallelism works in the Bible. It's part of why this stuff is so hard. It's just a thing to look at and think about. it's so new to me that I haven't had a chance to process it beyond just this sort of interesting, I wonder, reaction that I have, which you probably have too. I still found myself scratching my head on that one. But here's kind of everything we've talked about. In the immediate context of Genesis 18 and 19, the story of Sodom concerns gross violations of the customs of hospitality. Second, the larger Genesis context can see the story of Sodom as an inversion of the story of the Ben Ha-Elohim, the B'nai Ha-Elohim. In other words, Genesis 6 and Genesis 19 are inversions of each other. Often Sodom and Gomorrah are used as an exemplar of utter destruction. I only gave you one example, but there are several in the Bible. When Jesus sends out his disciples, he applies the lesson of Sodom to the issue of hospitality that the disciples will or will not receive. The prophetic understanding of the sin of Sodom concerns economic justice, broadly described as caring for the poor and not eating everything in sight. So greed versus a charitable compassion. This one is interesting. Jesus comparing the sudden and unexpected destruction of Sodom to the unexpected last days. So this is similar to the idea of Sodom and Gomorrah as an example of utter destruction, but here the focus, this is the very last thing we were looking at, the focus is on how unexpected it is, and that perhaps he seems to include in the one taken, one left motif, both a gay couple and a lesbian couple who are engaged in sex at the unexpected moment. Well, I guess if you were planning for the last days to come, I mean, that would be like the unexpected moment. So I can see how that would work as a symbol. I don't know what to do with that. Seems perhaps, I'm not pushing that too far. I just find that a really intriguing exegesis of the text. But it's at least sound based on actual use of words and the structure. Doesn't necessarily mean that's what it is saying, but it certainly is intriguing.
But the example of lying in bed implies to me that they're together as opposed to they were standing next to the well. And in the context of grinding,
they're together.
But again, they're together.
The emphasis is...
The last point, I take it as that's what is meant by that.
That they're together?
They're a couple.
Yeah, the men are a couple and the women are a couple.
And the women are a couple.
Yes.
Otherwise, why not say the men were standing at the well?
Yeah. I don't disagree that that's, I think that's a very, okay, hear me, because this is, sometimes I've been with a text long enough that I'm like, yeah, I know what that means. Sometimes that, because I've known this text for a long time. I mean, I come out of that fundamentalist world of, waiting for the second coming and the rapture and all that stuff. So the rapture texts are like, oh, one is taken, one is left. There's even a song about that, being left behind. And there's a whole series about being left behind, right? The whole Left Behind series. So all of a sudden I'm going, wait a second, is this two couples? Are we talking about two couples in the ancient world and Jesus is specifically referring to them? I find that intriguing. I don't want to come to an absolute conclusion, but that to me is really intriguing. And ask me in about 10 years how I think that text is going. But initially I'm like, whoa, And I find myself coming to that sort of, doesn't this mean these people are together? It doesn't imply that these are couples. I don't know, I don't want to push that, but I want to acknowledge that that's a reasonable and sound exegetical interpretation of the passage based on its language and the use of that language in the scripture as a whole. And based on what I know of Matthew, it would make sense for Matthew to fix that, because that's a little uncomfortable. Because Matthew doesn't like to talk about that stuff. So inserting the word meal would take care of that.
But if they're both paralleling each other, what effect is changing? They both mean the same thing. She's only changing one, so still the effect of the original is still there in the second one.
What it does if Matthew does that is that it breaks the parallelism. So if the parallelism is there, you have two couples. If you break the parallelism, then it becomes random. It becomes they just happen to be together. These women just happen to be at the mill at the same time. Yeah, it takes away any possible sexual interpretation of the first part because you remove it in the second part. But with it being in the second part in Luke, it pushes you back to look at the first one because a lot of people sleep in the same bed. Right. That's not doesn't necessarily mean anything, but the minute you throw in a second one, you suddenly are forced to confront the possibility that the two are parallel lines. And so Matthew's insertion of a single Greek word, I don't want to push that too far. I just found that really interesting, and so I didn't want you to go home without being as puzzled and startled by it as I was. so there's a couple. So next week, I know that part of what we're going to be working on next week is going to be the Leviticus texts. And there's two significant pieces of New Testament text that we have to look at as well. One is in Romans and the other is 1 Corinthians. And these are actually fairly technical. So my guess is that next week we'll probably mostly look at the Levitical text, and I'll introduce some concepts that will be relevant. And the following week when we'll be in the Corinthians text, and then the week after that we'll be in the Romans text. That's what I'm expecting right now. I'm only half sorry, but it is almost 7:20. So I have kept you a little longer than I intended. I do my best, but